In the freezing, dark mid-November of 1941, the chiefs of staff of the German Wehrmacht gathered in the Belarusian town of Orsha for a monumental and desperate strategic conference. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army High Command, passionately argued for one final supreme lunge to capture Moscow, believing the Soviet Union was on the absolute brink of total collapse. However, the operational reality on the ground was catastrophic. Over 2,000 German tanks had been permanently lost, with less than a third replaced, and supply trucks were breaking down at an unsustainable rate, forcing infantry divisions to demotorize. In our alternate timeline, Hitler, haunted by the shadows of Napoleon's winter defeat, overrules Halder's reckless ambition. Recognizing that the Wehrmacht's logistical neck is already broken, he orders all offensive operations on Moscow to halt immediately. Instead of launching Phase 2 of Operation Typhoon, Army Group Center is ordered to dig in, establish fortified defensive lines, and prepare for a brutal Russian winter. On December 5, 1941, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov unleashed his massive, highly anticipated winter counteroffensive. Historically, this strike slammed into exhausted, freezing, and overextended German units, triggering a chaotic retreat that nearly destroyed Army Group Center. In this alternate timeline, the Red Army's cold fury crashes not into an overextended vanguard, but into a deeply fortified and fully prepared German defensive wall. Siberian divisions, equipped with heavy winter gear and T-34 tanks, assault the Ruza and Lama river lines, but they find no easy breakthroughs. Instead, they are met with concentrated, radar-guided artillery fire and dense, layered minefields. While Soviet forces attempt to bypass the strongpoints, German panzer divisions, held in reserve and fully fueled, launch localized, highly coordinated counterattacks. The initial shock of Zhukov's winter offensive is successfully blunted, preventing the catastrophic collapse of the German front line and turning the snow-covered plains of western Russia into a massive meat grinder for the Red Army. With the offensive called off in mid-November, the German army was granted a vital window of several weeks before the onset of the deepest sub-zero winter temperatures. Rather than being caught overextended in thin summer uniforms on the open plains outside Moscow, the Wehrmacht established a cohesive, well-planned defensive screen along the natural barriers of the Ruza and Lama rivers. Millions of logs were felled to build dense timber bunkers, deep trenches were dug, and heating stoves were distributed to the frontline troops. Crucially, the precious remaining panzer divisions were pulled back from the immediate front and placed into highly mobile tactical reserves. German engineers laid vast anti-tank minefields and established heavy anti-tank gun screens. By transitioning to a voluntary and organized defensive posture, Germany preserved the operational strength of its mechanized forces and saved tens of thousands of its finest soldiers from freezing to death on the icy roads of Russia. Throughout the bitter winter of 1941 and 1942, the Eastern Front became a stage for a new kind of warfare, a systematic, highly disciplined war of defensive attrition. In contrast to Hitler's rigid, historical no-retreat orders that resulted in entire German divisions being bypassed and encircled, Wehrmacht commanders in this timeline are granted tactical flexibility. Under the guiding hands of defensive masters like General Walter Model, German forces practice an elastic defense, trading non-essential snow-covered space for time, while systematically funneled Soviet attacks into pre-planned kill zones. The Wehrmacht's anti-tank guns and defensive minefields chew up the waves of Soviet infantry and armor at a devastating ratio. By conserving their manpower, conserving their fuel, and utilizing the warmth of their fortified timber bunkers, the German military successfully weathers the absolute worst of the Russian winter, keeping their core fighting divisions and mechanized armies entirely intact. By halting the Moscow offensive in November 1941, Germany deliberately abandoned any possibility of knocking the Soviet Union out of the war in its first year. The Eastern Front settled into a long, grueling, and highly unstable strategic stalemate. While the Wehrmacht preserved its finest veteran soldiers and heavy armor, they were now locked in the very nightmare they sought to avoid, a multi-front war of global attrition against the combined industrial empires of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. Without the dramatic losses of 1941, Germany would launch highly calculated offensives in 1942, but the strategic scales had permanently tipped. Allied Lend-Lease continued to motorize the Red Army, while the Western Allies prepared their massive bombing campaigns. Bypassing the initial winter collapse of 1941 only delayed the inevitable, dragging the war in Europe out until 1946 or 1947, and ultimately paving the way for a nuclear climax over Germany.